Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the FifthxxChild podcast, the weekly podcast where I give you two different recommendations for either anime, video games, movies, or television. I am Chris, and I'm going to be your podcaster for today. So this podcast has been a long time coming, precisely almost a month coming. So if you've been listening into the previous podcast episodes, I have been saying that a lot of these podcasts were, one, shorter because of time constraints due to personal life such as my work life and such, and then also because I have been playing Fire Emblem Three Houses for the Nintendo Switch. Well, today is actually the day I'm finally going to be able to talk about this game at length. So sit tight, strap yourself in, we're going to go ahead and just jump right into the podcast episode. And the video game, the only video game and the only piece of today's podcast is going to be Fire Emblem Three Houses, the newest Fire Emblem game for the Nintendo Switch. So to go into this at length, we're going to go ahead and talk about my history with the Fire Emblem series. So my first official exposure to the Fire Emblem series was the first official exposure for pretty much every single American Fire Emblem player. And that was with Super Smash Bros. Melee for the GameCube, or for the Nintendo GameCube. Back when the Nintendo GameCube first came out, the first new game, one of the first new games for the GameCube was the newest Super Smash Bros. Game, Super Smash Bros. Melee, which at that time was the second game. So out of all the character rosters that we got introduced to, we got a lot of new characters, but there were two massive outliers, and that was that two characters from the Fire Emblem series. We got Marth, the main character from the first Fire Emblem game and the third, and then we got Roy, the main character from the sixth Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem and the Sealed Sword. Now, this time, none of us knew exactly who these characters were because either we didn't know about the game outside of Japan, or we didn't know about the game. The game was never released outside of Japan, and this was our first major exposure to anything Fire Emblem. So naturally, this made all of us American gamers curious, and then less than a year after, we then finally received our first official Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem: The Blazing Sword for the Game Boy Advance, or just titled Fire Emblem in Japan, and it was just titled Fire Emblem in America. And this was my first Fire Emblem game I had ever played. One of my favorite Game Boy Advance games. I love the original Fire Emblem for Game Boy Advance that first came out. And then more and more, we got more exposure to the other Fire Emblem games. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about pretty much all the Fire Emblem games that I've talked about before we jump into this, just to kind of provide you with a little bit of backstory going into Fire Emblem. So the first Fire Emblem game that was released is Fire Emblem and the Mystery of the Emblem. No, not Fire Emblem, Mystery of the Emblem. Fire Emblem and the Sword of Light and the Shadow Dragon, which was released for the Nintendo Famicom system. So Fire Emblem, as I talked about in our War Groove episode a few episodes back, is a tactical JRPG. It's a tile-based tactical game where you are in control of a certain amount of units that have a certain class, either knights, mercenaries, mages, priests, and your lords, who are usually your main characters. And the main focus of the game is just to complete certain missions with either certain objectives, whether that is to rout an enemy completely, to take over an enemy's stronghold, or to defeat the main boss of the level. So the original game was released for the Nintendo Famicom and followed the adventure of Marth, a disgraced prince from the kingdom of Arcania, I think. And pretty much his adventure of trying to get back to his throne while also fighting against the forces of the evil Dark Dragon Medeus. So the original Fire Emblem game is actually not the best game in the series, and it's probably questionably maybe the worst game in the series. It is incredibly dated, and unfortunately, when it got a remake for the Nintendo DS, just titled Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, its age definitely showed, and it's actually one of the few Fire Emblem games I haven't actually finished. So that's all I can really say about Fire Emblem. That's all I can say about Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. I don't have a lot of positivity to say about that game. The next game that was released was Fire Emblem Gaiden, which was a side story with brand new characters, a brand new plot. I actually never played the original Fire Emblem Gaiden for the Famicom, But we'll come back to Gaiden in a little bit because there is a remake for the 3DS we'll talk about pretty soon. The next game in the series was Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, and also its remake, Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem for the DS. Just like, so Mystery of the Emblem is one half a updated remake of the original Fire Emblem game for the Super Nintendo. Excuse me. And the other half of it is a sequel to the original game. It's split up into 2 books, Book 1 and Book 2. Book 1 is a remake of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon for the Super Nintendo, and then Part 2 of it is just a completely brand new story that continues Marth's adventure as he continues to fight against the forces of Medeus, the Dark Dragon, and as well as the Dark Emperor. I've actually never finished or played this Fire Emblem 3 Mystery of the Emblem all the way through, and the remake Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem for the DS never actually made its way to America because of the very, very poor sales of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. So that's all I can really say about that. Now let's jump into Fire Emblem 4, Fire Emblem Seisen no Keifu, or Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. Genealogy of the Holy War back then was a big thing. For one, it boasted probably the biggest original soundtrack by a Fire Emblem series veteran, which I keep on forgetting her name. You'll see more of her later in the series as well. The composers do tend to change a lot, but the main composer, I believe, is Yuki Tsujiyoko. And during her tenure during the Super Nintendo era, she made the biggest soundtrack for Genealogy of the Holy War, so that was one of the bigger selling points. It's a very good soundtrack. And then the other major thing about Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War is that, one, it looks like it's a shorter game because there's only 11 maps to it, but the maps are much bigger. You had much more control over more of your units, compared to other games in the series when the maximum amount of units you could have on the field would be like 12 or so. Genealogy of the Holy War instead insisted that you could have up to probably about 24 or so, and the maps were huge. There were more enemy units, and there were bigger objectives, and if you completed an objective, another part of the map would open up before you completed the map entirely. One of the other big selling points about Genealogy of the Holy War is that it showcased a very, very real, very politically driven storyline about different countries fighting amongst each other. It was very, very Game of Thrones for its time, and it was much more mature. It still stands as probably one of the more mature Fire Emblem games in the series. It's not the best. A lot of people... We'll talk about what some people consider to be the best Fire Emblem games in a little bit, but Genealogy of the Holy War is very high up there. The next game in the series, Fire Emblem 5, is Thracia 776, which is actually a game I haven't played. I have, unfortunately, Genealogy of the Holy War, Thracia 776, and a couple other games have not been released officially or localized in English, so the only way you can play them is through emulation. I'm not going to say if I did that or not, but if I'm saying that if you could do it, I haven't actually played Thracia 776. Thracia 776 is actually a sequel to Genealogy of the Holy War, and one of the main plot points of Genealogy is that the game splits up at some point. There is a time skip where you get to play as the children of the main characters from the first half of the game. And in Thracia 776, you play as one of the other main characters, Leaf, who's one of the children of one of the other main characters in the first half. In the middle, kind of like near the beginning of this time skip, before it leads into the second half of Genealogy. It's one of the harder games from what I've heard. I want to play it at some point. I really love Genealogy of the Holy War, and I like to play its direct sequel, or direct midquel, I guess is the correct term we should say. But I haven't played it, wish I could. Now, the next game in the series that was released was Fire Emblem 6 for the Game Boy Advance, Fire Emblem and the Sealed Sword. And this game is actually a game that is heavily linked to Fire Emblem 7, Fire Emblem the Blazing Sword, the first game that we got in America. In Fire Emblem 6, you get to play as Roy, the son of the main character in Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, who is one of the main characters one of the characters we can play as in Super Smash Bros. Melee. And to say the least, Sacred Sword or Sealed Sword does not really hold up all that well. For the first Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem game, it's incredibly unbalanced. The random number generator is so out of tune in Fire Emblem Sealed Sword. Enemy stats are through the roof. They're incredibly unbalanced, and so are your own units. It's not the most fun game to play, unfortunately. And I would like to say the story holds up, but unfortunately the story doesn't. One might say that the Sealed Sword is basically just a retelling in a completely different continent of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. Just replace Marth with Roy, and you basically have the same exact plot, except Roy is even less charismatic than Marth, if you can believe that. So it's not my favorite game in the series. It's not my least favorite. I have least favorite games in Fire Emblem, but it's definitely not a big fan of Sealed Sword. It's fun the first time you play it, but there's not a lot to bring you back to it. We've already talked about the first Fire Emblem game. I love it. It's one of my favorite Game Boy Advance games ever. And then the next game, Fire Emblem 8, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, is another really good entry. Sacred Stones takes place on a completely other continent. That's one of the main themes you'll find out in Fire Emblem, is that these games kind of take place in the same world for the most part, but you can imagine as though they take place in different time periods and different continents. And Fire Emblem and the Sealed Sword, or Fire Emblem and the Sacred Stone, takes place in the continent of Margrave, Margelv, I think, was the pronunciation of it. And one of the bigger selling points is that there's two main characters where you get to play as two twins, Ephraim and Erica, as they try to retake their kingdom back when the evil Grotto Empire attacks all the neighboring continents looking for the Sacred Stones in order to resurrect the Demon King. It's a very interesting plot. It has some of the coolest villains in the series. I think the only detriment to the game is that, one, it's definitely a little bit easier than the other Fire Emblem games, so it's not the hardest game in the series by any means whatsoever. There's still some challenge, but it's not that hard. And the other major thing about it is that it's a little too short. Otherwise, I really like Sacred Stones, and it's still one of my personal favorites. I like it a lot. I like it for the story. I think the villains are great. And then this leads us into the consoles. For the first time since Thracia 776, we finally got Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, the next console game for the Nintendo GameCube. And Path of Radiance could maybe be my personal favorite Fire Emblem game. I'm still debating it. We'll talk about why I'm debating it during this podcast. But Path of Radiance has easily my favorite story in the Fire Emblem series. Again, just like most Fire Emblem games that are introduced, the main evil force you get to fight against is again another big empire that's trying to invade other countries on the continent or whatever. And your main character in Path of Radiance is actually the son of a mercenary, Ike. And Ike is one of the most interesting main characters that I've seen in a JRPG. I love Ike. He's one of the best characters. He's easily maybe the best main protagonist in the entire Fire Emblem series. And the story he goes through is one of the most personal stories I've ever seen. All of the other supporting characters are great as well. One of the best things about the Fire Emblem series is that you get to enjoy a certain amount of a relationship between your main character and the supporting characters and everyone else around them. Throughout every single one of these Fire Emblem games, you get to pair up with other units, and then that increases their support with one another, and that's how you get to see some conversations occur between these characters and develop their personalities. And Path of Radiance certainly has some of the best characters I've seen in the series as well. Another one of the best aspects of the game is that it does deal with some pretty heady political themes. Just like Genealogy of the Holy War, there are some very heavy-handed politics in the game. And there's also a really nice theme about racism and race within the series that I definitely enjoy. One of the main conflicts in Path of Radiance is a conflict between human beings, regular human beings, and human beings who have the ability to shapeshift into man and beast hybrids. And there's a bit of an attack on racism throughout this entire game. It does serve as a critique about racism and trying to overcome the identity that you have that people hate, and trying to attack prejudices. And I really enjoyed Path of Radiance for introducing that into a Nintendo game. The next game in the series was actually a direct sequel to Path of Radiance, and that is Radiant Dawn. The problem is I actually haven't finished Radiant Dawn. Radiant Dawn is one of the hardest games to get for the Nintendo Wii. It's extremely expensive, as is Path of Radiance. I was lucky enough to have played it before its price jack up. I have not gotten lucky with Radiant Dawn yet. Radiant Dawn does follow the same sort of story that Path of Radiance does. You get to follow Ike on a different adventure. Now, unfortunately, I can't say too much about the story because I haven't actually finished the game. Haven't really gotten that far into it when I first borrowed it back in high school. So that's all I will say about Path of Radiance. And then in between the time that Path of Radiance and other games in the series came out, that's when we saw the remakes. That's when we saw Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. That's when we saw Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem. The problem is that these games did not sell well. Shadow Dragon had really poor sales in America due to the fact that they released a very, very outdated game for the DS without changing much of it. And the New Mystery of the Emblem, even though it was an improvement on Shadow Dragon, wasn't released in America, and even in Japan it didn't release fair enough sales. So this marked a big change for Fire Emblem. And Nintendo told the developer for Fire Emblem, Intelligent Systems, that they must make a change. And the next game that they were going to release was a game called Fire Emblem Awakening for the Nintendo 3DS back in 2012 and 2013 in America. Now, the problem with this game is that Nintendo sent out an ultimatum to Intelligent Systems. The ultimatum was, this could very well be your last Fire Emblem game you will ever produce. If you do not recoup the amount of sales that we are anticipating for this game, if this does not break, I believe, 1 million cartridges sold. I think that might have been the mark. I think that might have been the mark that Nintendo told them. Then Nintendo would completely scrap the Fire Emblem series and tell Intelligent Systems to work on other properties that could be more lucrative for Nintendo. And the result of that was Fire Emblem Awakening, which is, up until the release of Three Houses, the highest-selling Fire Emblem game of all time, a game that bridged together new fans and old fans in the series, and has brought Fire Emblem back from the ashes and into the public eye to make Fire Emblem probably one of Nintendo's most lucrative properties, besides Mario and Zelda and Super Smash Bros. It is an event whenever a new Fire Emblem game comes out now because of Fire Emblem Awakening. Fire Emblem Awakening brought in so many new mechanics that helps ease in more casual fans. One of the biggest gripes that many people have about the Fire Emblem games, unless you're a veteran, is that there is a permadeath aspect to the game. If a character dies in the game, they're dead for the rest of the game, unless they have a major story plot point later on down the road. Unless they have a major story plot point down the road, they die in battle, they're out of the game. You never get to use them again. Awakening introduced a casual mode, where in casual mode, if a person dies, then if a person falls in battle, then they just come back for the next fight. They don't die. There's also so many more difficulty options for Fire Emblem Awakening than ever before seen in the series, and the plot itself was a lot more straightforward. There wasn't a lot of political jargon. Again, we get to follow... Again, this is the same kind of gameplay where there's a big empire, but there's less politics involved, unlike Genealogy of the Holy War and Path of Radiance. And the main story kind of has a bit of a gimmick with time travel that rubbed some veterans the wrong way. It seemed as though it was a game that tried to be deeper and complex when it really was a little bit too simplistic. Most of the characters were great, although some people complain that they're more tropey and less deep than other characters in the series. But altogether, Awakening did what it was supposed to do and helped save the Fire Emblem series. And that leads into the next game, Fire Emblem Fates, which was given the Pokemon treatment and split up into 3 different games, where you can buy one game for $40, and then you can buy the other 2 games at $20 a pop each. If you had already bought if you already bought one specific game for $40. Fates was broken up into 3 games: Birthright, Conquest, and Revelations. And the main story in Fates involves you, the main character Corrin, as you get torn between 2 kingdoms fighting each other: the kingdom of Hoshido and the kingdom of Nor. And Corrin, unfortunately, and Corrin, who was raised in the Kingdom of Nor as an adoptive son to the Emperor, or adoptive daughter, because you can play Corrin as a lady if you want to, is then revealed that their actual siblings are the siblings and royal family of Hoshido, the warring faction of Nor, and Corrin has to make a choice. In Birthright, you either get to choose the Hoshidan nobles, who are your actual birth family, or you get to join your adoptive family that you've been with your entire life in Conquest. And herein lies the issue with Fire Emblem Fates. Fire Emblem Fates tried to have some sort of moral dilemma with its storyline, and this led to some very, very iffy character choices and some pretty dumb plot points. So Fire Emblem Fates Birthright isn't nearly as bad as Conquest. The main story in Birthright is that you do have to follow the Hoshidian nobles, and you have to fight your siblings in Nor, who were your adoptive siblings your entire life, and that did involve some moral dilemma that you're having to fight against your siblings. Even though the father, the king Garen of Nor, is it's so obvious that he's the main villain. It's so obvious that he's completely, totally evil, and it's an evil that your Norian siblings decide to ignore the entire game for Birthright, but there is a little bit of moral dilemma there. The problem with Fire Emblem Conquest is that when you side with the Norian nobles, and then you find out that King Garen is bad, you basically have to push 500 pounds of idiot up a mountain the entire game to try to convince your noble family in Nor that King Garen is bad. And it's stupid. It's really, really stupid, and it removes almost all the moral dilemmas of Fire Emblem Fates, and it gets even worse in Fire Emblem Revelations, where you decide to choose neither side, and then you find out that there is an even greater evil out there. And it's an interdimensional space eyeball dragon, and it's stupid. I have many thoughts about Fire Emblem Fates' story, and I don't even care if the gameplay's good. Unfortunately, the gameplay for Fire Emblem Fates was really good. It was a step up from Awakening. It included much of the same elements that made Awakening great, and made it a lot more accessible. But unfortunately, that's not enough to excuse the fact that the story was utter garbage. So after Fates, despite that, Fates was still fairly popular enough on its own, mostly because of its appeal to the casual crowd, and this is one of the problems where we saw a divide in the Fire Emblem fan base, and that is because the fan base divided between the veterans and the casual players, and the veterans tended to see Fire Emblem Awakening and Fates as less Fire Emblem games and more waifu simulators. Because there's romance options in Awakening and Fates, that unfortunately takes away from the tactical JRPG aspects of it, and basically makes it a social life simulator when you try to make matchmaking with all the different characters, and it takes away from the gameplay quite a bit. So then fast forward to 2017, and then we got a new Fire Emblem game, which is a remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden, Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadows of Valentia. And Shadows of Valentia is easily probably the most underrated game in the series, and that's mostly because of the story and the production for Shadows of Valentia. So Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia is the first major Fire Emblem game ever to have completely voice-acted cutscenes and dialogue. If there is dialogue by a single character in Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia, it is voice acted, and the voice acting is spot on. This is one of the best English localizations I have seen out of a JRPG in a long time. Not even Persona 5 was this good. Another aspect of the game that was even great is the story. One of the main conflict in Shadows of Valentia is that you play two main characters, Alm and Celica, who are two best friends since childhood, who then got separated due to another major military conflict. And you get to play the games in separate sides. You get to play Alm's story for a bit, then you get to play Celica's story for a little bit, until you see them finally diverge. And it's one of the most compelling stories in the Fire Emblem series. I don't think it's as good as Path of Radiance, or we'll talk about this in a little bit, or the game we're going to talk about in this podcast, but it is still extremely good. The only problem, the reason why the game is so underrated is that, again, unfortunately, like Shadow Dragon, it does show its age a little bit. One of the main aspects of the Fire Emblem series is that there is a weapon triangle. The weapon triangle showcases that if you have shows swords, lances, and axes, and this helped give a certain level of depth and complexity to the gameplay. If one of your units uses a sword and they're up against a fighter on the enemy side with an axe, that sword has an advantage against an axe. In the same way, a lance has an advantage against a sword, and then an axe has an advantage against a lance. Because of the datedness of Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia, though, there is no weapon triangle, and it kind of takes away from some of the strategic elements of the Fire Emblem series that have improved itself since Genealogy of the Holy War. Besides that, though, I think Shadows of Valentia is still one of the better games in the series because of its extremely strong story and its fantastic production values. And then that leads us to now. Oh, I guess we should probably talk about Fire Emblem Heroes. There was a mobile game. It's basically it's a half pay to play kind of game, but it's still decently fun. There's not as much tactical strength to it as other Fire Emblem games, but it's a fun little time waster if you need something to play on your iPhone or Droid. So now we can officially talk about the game for this week's podcast. And obviously, we've talked about the Fire Emblem series, so we're going to go ahead and talk about the newest game in the Fire Emblem series, Fire Emblem and the Three Houses, released for the Nintendo Switch as of July 25th, literally last month. So, Fire Emblem and the Three Houses is the newest game in the Fire Emblem series released for the Nintendo Switch. The game is currently available for $60. It's still relatively new, so do not expect this game to go on sale anytime soon. But I have been playing this game for the last month or so, and as of now, I have put in about 155 hours into the game, and I feel like I've seen mostly everything that the game has to offer. I would like to revisit it at some point, but there are other games I want to play as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the game. So, the main concept of the game. So, like the other Fire Emblem series, this is again a tactical tile-based RPG. I've already talked about how, since we've gone into this whole preamble of what a Fire Emblem game is, I'm not going to go into exactly what Fire Emblem itself, Fire Emblem Three Houses itself, does differently or the same. I'm going to talk about what it does differently. So the game itself doesn't take any major broad strokes as far as, doesn't take any new broader strokes compared to other Fire Emblem games, except for what you can do in the day-to-day life of the game. So Fire Emblem The Three Houses' main story takes place on the continent of Foldland. Foldland is a continent that is split up into three major factions: the Leicester Alliance, the I can't pronounce that name. The Fragulous Kingdom. Hold on. I'm gonna figure out how to freaking pronounce that name. Give me a second to look that up. The Holy Kingdom of Fargus. Gosh, I was thinking of Dimitri's last name. And mixing them up. So there's the Holy Kingdom of Fargus, and then the Adestrian Empire. And so we're at a point in peacetime. There has been some wars that have occurred in Foldland, and one of the major wars was the War of the Heroes, which was a conflict between the Adestrian Empire allied with 10 heroes called the 10 Elites and the 4 Saints of Seiros, along with Saint Seiros herself. And the conflict was between them and also the Liberation Army led by King Nemesis, the King of Liberation, who used an ancient relic created from the goddess known as the Sword of the Creator. This conflict ended with the death of Nemesis by Saint Seiros herself, and after this established the Adestrian Empire as the strongest force in the entire continent, as well as the Church of Seiros, which was the main governing body of Foldland for this entire time, a major centralized government that united the three kingdoms in somewhat peaceful harmony. So we fast forward to the present times, and your main character is a character that you name yourself. You can name whatever you want to. You can make her a boy or a girl. You make them a boy or a girl. But the character name that you give is Byleth. Byleth is the son of a mercenary known as Geralt, and during their adventures, they run in, and at the very, very beginning of the game, they run into you run into the three main characters of Three Houses besides Byleth, each one of them representing the three different kingdoms. You have the princess of the emperor, excuse me, had a hiccup. You have the princess of the emperor of Edestria, Edelgard. You have Dimitri, the prince of the Holy Kingdom of Fargus, and then you have Claude von Regan of House Regan in the Leicester Alliance. During this encounter, they are overrun by bandits, and Byleth and the three heroes of the game have to work together in order to fight against these bandits. After they succeed, they are then invited by the Church of Byleth, and her father Geralt are then invited to the Church of Saros to help teach at the Church of Saros in at the Garrick Mach Monastery, an officers' academy where nobles and commoners from all three of the different countries in Foldland come together in order to learn about academics, in order to learn about military tactics, in order to go back into their homeland and be strong military commanders. And your main character, Byleth, is a professor, and some of the day-to-day life that you get to see in Fire Emblem Three Houses is you getting to teach every single one of your units throughout the game. Now, another aspect of the game is that the game can split up into 3 different playthroughs. When you first begin in the game, you have to choose between one of 3 houses your first time through it. You get to either pick the Black Eagles, which is led by Edelgard, where you get to see more and more, where you get to fight alongside 7 other units in the Edestrian Empire. You could side with the Blue Lions, who is led by Dimitri and all the other Holy Kingdom of Fargus, the other Kingdom of Fargus nobles, or you can join Claude and other noble. You can join Claude in the Golden Deer, as well as the other nobles and commoners within that house. From the Leicester Alliance. And this is interesting, because this means that you are required to have to play this game multiple times in order to understand the full scope of the story. You can play, we'll go into some of this a little bit later, but at some point in time, when you, for the first 12 or so chapters of the game, you get to play in the churches, you get to play within your house, either the Black Eagles, the Golden Deer, or the Blue Lions, and then something happens, and then we get a time skip. And depending on whose house you play through, that time skip could be a completely different story depending on who you pick. We'll go into this a little bit later. There's going to be some mild spoilers for the post-time skip later, and I will gladly tag that and flag that and let you know within this podcast when we're actually about to reach up to that. But that's the main general flow of the game. You get to choose, after you choose whichever house you get to play as, you then go through this day-to-day life simulator. There's a calendar month. You get to go throughout an entire calendar month, not like day by day, but pretty much on a week-to-week basis. And every single Saturday is a free day. And during that free day, you get to do either 4 different things. You can either rest and recuperate to raise your motivation. You can go do some battles where, depending on what difficulty you play on, you can either grind in these battles, or you have a set amount of grinding you can do, and then you have to be done for the day. Or you can have 2 different things. One is when you get to explore. You get to explore Garrick Mach Monastery and actually have conversations with all your other supporting characters, either within your house or in other people's house. You can also explore, find different objects that can help you throughout the game, that can help give you ingredients. You can find gifts, you can find lost items that you can give back to your units in order to raise their supports. Like other games in the series, there is a support system where either in battle, when you get to play alongside, if you're on adjacent tiles and you're fighting together, you can raise your supports that way, and then you can see support conversations like other Fire Emblem games, or you can eat out with your friends, eat out with your students as well. There are different activities you can do. For one, you can cook with one of your friends, and if you cook with one of your friends, depending on what dish you make, it can raise either your health, your stat points, or whatever for the entire month or week. You can also eat with 2 other students at the same time. And what this can do is, and what this will do is, one, it'll raise their motivation, and then it'll make it easier for you to teach them. We'll talk about that in a second. And then another thing that it helps out with is that both Byleth and the other 2 people will then have their supports raised up. So that can help you have more of those support conversations as you go down the road. You can also go fishing, which is a great way to raise your professor level. And one of the things that you have to do when you're in the exploring phase is that you use up explorer points depending on what activity you do. And in order to raise your explorer points more, you have to raise your professor level. You can do this through different activities, through having successful teaching moments with your students. You can raise it by fishing, by gardening, which you can also do as well. You can also raise you can raise your professor level by having different meals with every single one of your students. You can raise them by giving the right gifts, making your students happy. And it's really awesome. It's really, really cool how much freedom you have within this game whenever you're exploring. As long as your professor level's high enough and you have enough explorer points. Once you're out of explorer points, you have to end your free day, and then you have to go on to the next week. Another thing you can do is you can have a seminar, which I didn't really use that much. Whenever you have a seminar, you can pick whichever character you want. You can either have Byleth, or you can have some of the other professors in the academy as well, like Hanneman, or Aloy, or Gerald, and then they can teach certain stats. And then this is where another aspect comes in, where you can teach your students. Every single Sunday, for the most part, you can then begin a set course of lectures throughout the entire week. You don't get to lecture during this time, but you can set different goals for your students as well. If you want, let's say you're in the Black Eagles, and let's say you want your archer, Bernadetta, to also be good with the lance. You can set her goals to have stat points increase in a bow and have the stat points increase in a lance. And then you can instruct them. And this helps very incrementally, especially near the beginning of the game. And what you can do is, just as you have your explorer points, you have your instruction points as well, depending on what your professor level is. And this allows you to go through a little cycle where you can increase a certain stat point as much times as you're able to, depending on how many instructor points that you have. You can do this for multiple stats, for multiple characters. You can also set your characters to have certain group tasks together. You could make 2 people help clean the stables. You could have 2 people help patrol with Pegasus. There's different things that there's a lot of different ways that you can increase your stat points. Besides going into battle and increasing your stats the regular JRPG way of just fighting and grinding. So that's cool. There's a lot of freedom within this game as far as the gameplay. In terms of so that's pretty much like all you can do within the actual game itself. The game is very similar to Persona, where you have to manage your time wisely, manage what you can do within a game, within a gameplay cycle. But if you're the right kind of person who likes that kind of micromanagement, then this is easily one of the best life school simulators I think I've ever played of before, and it just so happens to be tightly packaged together with a very, very tightly well-made tactical RPG as well. So this does lead into what I do see as one of the problems with Fire Emblem Three Houses, and that's that the game doesn't take any major broad strokes in terms of the core Fire Emblem gameplay. A lot of the missions are very, very simple. It's either route out an enemy completely or defeat an enemy commander. There's not a lot of variety in terms of the missions themselves, and there's actually a bit of a step back. Just like with Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia, there's actually no weapons triangle. So that does kind of hinder some of the strategical elements of what you can do. Now, some elements that were not present in past Fire Emblem games do come back in this game. For example, you get abilities. And what abilities are is that whenever you increase a certain weapon stat or whatever stat a certain amount, whenever you rank up the stat, you have the likelihood of getting a new ability, which you can then equip. There's a ton of different abilities. There's one that allows you to increase your attack with a sword. There's one that allows you to increase your attack with bow, that increases your critical with a bow or an axe or a lance or whatever, that allows you to have an advantage if you're attacked first, to have an advantage if you have lower HP than your enemy, have a better advantage if your speed is lower, whatever. There's so many different abilities that you can get that they kind of make up for the fact that there's no weapons triangle. For example, there is an ability that if you have an axe and you're fighting a lance, then your axe has an advantage against the lance. It sucks you have to equip an ability to do that, but it's still there. A couple of the other major changes in terms of the tactical gameplay is that, one, you get combat arts. What combat arts are different abilities. They're separate from abilities that you equip to your main character. They are attacks that are based on whatever weapon you're using. If your stats for your weapon are high enough, you can use these combat arts. And sometimes it can really turn the tide of a fight. The problem is that, like other Fire Emblem games, weapons have certain durability to them. You can only use a weapon a certain amount of times before you end up losing it, or before it gets broken and you have to go to a blacksmith, say, and go fix it. Which you do get a blacksmith in the game that allows you to repair your weapons and allows you to forge them into stronger weapons. But back to the combat arts. If you use a combat art, you use not just the one durability point for one attack that you usually use, you actually could use anywhere up to 5, depending on whatever combat art you're using. So the combat arts do provide a good risk versus reward aspect to the gameplay. They're especially very important early on, especially if you're playing a hard mode. If you're playing on hard mode, you're going to probably be using your combat arts a little bit more than you would later game. Oddly enough, though, in all 3 of my playthroughs of the game, I didn't really use the combat arts all that much in the late game, so they kind of become a little inconsequential. The same thing kind of goes with battalions as well. Battalions, kind of like with Wargroove, are unlike Wargroove, where you don't equip a certain battalion to a unit or whatever. Battalions are actual little factions that you can equip to whatever character that you want, depending on how high their authority stat is. If their authority stat's high enough, they could use a C rank or B rank or A rank battalion or whatever. And what they are is that they add another special attack that usually do not provoke an enemy to counterattack you as well. So they're useful in that respect. The other ways that they're useful is that depending on what battalion you have, they also increase a couple of your stats as well. For if you want, say we're in the Black Eagles and I'm playing as Petra, if I want Petra to be stronger with a critical sword, I can equip a battalion that increases her critical stat and her physical attack and make her use her critical attacks much more. So there's that aspect. Later in the game, around chapter 6 or so, you then get to fight against these things called Dark Beasts. And Dark Beasts have these stupid barriers that you have to either attack twice with one weapon in order to break it and then daze the enemy enough for you to actually hit past the barrier, or you can use a battalion. And depending on how strong that battalion is and how much range it has, you could potentially knock out a good portion of their barrier in one go, or knock out the entire barrier if your battalion's overpowered. So there's a lot of usefulness for the battalions at any point in the game. Sometimes they may not seem so useful, but there are multiple times that they are extremely useful. Just like other games, like I said, you can increase your supports with other characters by playing them side by side. But in terms of some of the broader strokes of how they change much of the game, I wouldn't say it's a step down as much as it is kind of a little stagnant. Some of the changes in terms of the overall gameplay, the overall tactical gameplay, isn't too big of a difference for me to really say that this is a revolutionary game. The new revolutionary traits of the gameplay come more or less from the actual day-to-day simulator, the life and school simulator aspects, and that's kind of what makes the game a little bit more interesting. But where Three Houses does excel, and excels as a revolutionary form of gameplay, is in its narrative. So we're going to talk about the game. We're going to actually start talking about the story a little bit. I'm actually going to probably talk about some of the stuff that Nintendo hasn't quite revealed yet. For now, I'm going to talk about what we do know. Once we get to the point when I can talk about some of the major spoilers, I will get to that, but for now, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it just for whatever Nintendo has just told us for now. So one of the main conflicts in Fire Emblem Three Houses is are these mission-based objectives where you work alongside the Church of Seiros either to rout out bandits or also to rout out different dissidents within the continent of Fodlan itself that have risen up to try to take down the church. And this leads to some of the more interesting aspects of the story where we kind of learn a little bit more about Fodlan, we learn more and more about the Church of Seiros, we learn more about the Three Kingdoms, and we find out that not everything is all that it seems, particularly when we get a little bit closer to the time skip. Now every single route is a little different. I'm going to talk about every single gameplay. I'm going to talk about mainly what I think about the Three Houses themselves. So if I were to actually rank my personal favorite house, I'm not going to rank what I think about the houses quite yet. When I first played the game, I actually played the game through the Blue Lions playthrough first. So you get to play as either the Blue Lions, the Golden Deer, or the Black Eagles. So the Black Eagles route is kind of a little bit more similar to your standard fare of Fire Emblem gameplay. It's your traditional Fire Emblem story. It's not too terribly different. The same could also be said for the Golden Deer playthrough. It's a little bit traditional Fire Emblem up until the very end. Then it starts changing the tradition a little bit. The Blue Lions playthrough was actually one of the more unique storylines, and we'll come to that a little bit when we get to the time skip. So I played through the Blue Lions first. And this is one of the best aspects of the Fire Emblem Three Houses story, is how believable the characters are. When I first played my Blue Lions playthrough, I was shocked at how much I liked pretty much all my entire house. I loved Dimitri. I loved his story of coming to terms with trying to be a strong noble and eventually growing up to be the king of Fargus. I liked all of his retainers. I liked all of his helpers. I liked the little personal stories between him and his loyal guardian Dedue, which also brings to mind some of the Path of Radiance story as well, where there's a little bit of a racism aspect to it as well. Dedue himself comes from a different country known as Duscur within Fodlan, and what people didn't know, and what we eventually find out is that the Kingdom of Duscur was responsible for the previous king of Fargus being assassinated, and Dedue is looked down on for his heritage of being part of Duscur, so that's interesting as well. I liked the little personal plot I liked so many of the different personal plots with other characters, like for example Felix and his stoic nature and trying to figure out of what's going to happen when all conflict is gone. For a man who's only known how to wield a sword and nothing else, where is his place in peacetime, as well as his interesting dynamics with Dimitri, which we'll come to that in the time skip portion of the episode. I especially like the story with Sylvain as well. Now, one of the other aspects of the Fire Emblem story that we get to know about is that we get to know that a lot of nobles and some commoners as well, depending on what bloodline they're a part of, also have inherited crests based upon the 10 elites and based on the 4 saints. And these crests give them major abilities that have helped them in times of war, and have helped raise them to the station that they are at as the lords of the Kingdom of Fargus or the Destrian Empire or the Leicester Alliance. And I liked Sylvain's personal storyline where he hates the fact that he has a crest. Because despite the fact that Sylvain is a massive ladies' man, he actually does not like the attention that he gets from women. And he lashes out. And the reason why he flirts so much is that it's his form of lashing out, because of his heritage of having a crest. He's had to come to terms with the fact that most women who are interested in him are only interested in his crest and inheriting his bloodline, or as he would have it, having his crest baby, as eloquently as that would put. And you get to see so much of this character plotline within the support conversations that you have, and it's fantastic. I liked the Black Eagles plate. I liked the Black Eagles route as well. I liked the characters. I liked Ferdinand's rivalry with Edelgard. Ferdinand being another noble from another house in the Adjustrian Empire, and Edelgard being the freaking princess and daughter of the emperor. There's a rivalry between them that where Ferdinand always tries his best to catch up to Edelgard, but Edelgard's always one step ahead of them. I liked Lindhard, and I liked Caspar. I liked their relationship together. I like how Lindhard always seems like he's so always so bored by everything and tries to sleep until he finally finds something interesting, like magical research. I like Caspar and his hot-headedness. I like how he always likes to get into a fight no matter what, even though sometimes his head's not in the right place, he definitely has a good heart. I liked Dorothea. I liked her background as being a commoner who all of a sudden is around all these nobles, and her trying to use her status, even though she's wonderfully beautiful and wonderfully talented, and how she's still looked down upon, but because she's a commoner. All these characters just act in such human ways. One of my favorite characters, for example, is Bernadetta. I've talked about her as well. Bernadetta's one of the nobles in the Black Eagles playthrough, and she is just a total mess. She's an anxious mess. She's always worried about everything. And then when you learn more about her story and about the mental and physical abuse that she goes through because of her family and her father, it's actually kind of heartbreaking, and it's extremely relatable if you've ever had like an anxiety disorder or anything. It's like so crazy how much you could it's so crazy that I could see someone who has anxiety disorder really connecting with Bernadetta. We call her nickname's Bernie, which is, I think that's adorable. If I have to say my least favorite house, I'm not a big fan of the Golden Deer. I think the Golden Deer has probably some of the worst characters in the game, unfortunately. I played the Golden Deer playthrough second, and the main reason to play the Golden Deer playthrough is to play as Claude. Claude is one of the most charming main characters in a Fire Emblem game. He's an extremely suave, incredibly charming man. He is always cunning. He's always scheming. And yet he always manages to be so suave and charming while he's at it. You can tell that if there is something deeper, darker going on in Fodlan's history, you can bet Claude is on his way to figuring out what it is at some point. He's just a great character. Unfortunately, all the other house members are not the greatest, though. Not a big fan of Leonie because she's got a big superiority complex with Byleth because of their relationships with Gerald. Not a big fan of Raphael. He's kind of a big meathead. Ignatz, your main archer in Golden Deer, is pointless and has no personality despite the fact that he wants to paint. Hilda's a pain in the butt because she's so lazy and makes everyone else do everything despite the fact that she is a good unit. She's just an unlikable character to me, as someone who likes working hard and likes helping people. Hilda just kind of ticks me off. Hilda's personality just kind of ticks me off. She reminds me a little bit too much of people I know, so I definitely didn't like that. The only two characters I really liked were Marion and Lysithea. Lysithea herself is a kind of tragic character because she's a younger member. She's a younger noble in the Golden Deer house who also has 2 crests. Unfortunately, as we go throughout the game, we then learn and we get little hints dropped off that she may not have gotten that 2nd crest naturally, and it might be shortening her life. Marianne is also a very interesting character because, again, she also is a fine example of anxiety depressive disorder as well. And it's very unfortunate. Once you learn more and more about her backstory, it's also heartbreaking as well. And how little she thinks of herself, and also how tastefully they do it as well. For a Nintendo game, that I didn't expect them to go into I didn't expect them to introduce a very depressively suicidal character, but they do it very tastefully. But they do it in such a way that it is incredibly clear from her character dialogue that, yes, she is suicidally depressive and has probably attempted it. So I liked how tastefully they did that. So that's like all what I thought about all the 3 houses. Like I said, I've actually played through all 3 of the houses, and the houses themselves don't change too much, besides the characters. The first half of the game, the first 12 or so chapters, you're in the Church of Seiros at Garreg Mach with your respective house that you picked at the beginning of the game, until Chapter 13, when the time skip happens. And now at this point, we're going to go ahead and just talk about the time skip. I'm going to go into some of the spoilers, because the only way I can really talk about how I feel this game does itself correctly is by talking about the story past the time skip. So if you don't want to know too many time skip spoilers, I would really suggest skipping towards the end of the podcast. I'm going to put a tag of where you can skip to. After this point, I'm going to put the range of how long the spoiler talk's going to go on for. So just go ahead and go down to the description down below. Go ahead and skip to the next part of the video if you do not want to hear the spoilers. If you want to hear my final thoughts on this game, I would definitely do that. But we're going to go ahead and talk about the time skip. Now, Nintendo obviously has released, up until the game's release, that there is a time skip. We know it happens. We know that there is a certain point when 5 years have passed and the Adestrian Empire, the Kingdom of Fargus, and the Leicester Alliance have engaged in an all-out war with each other. And the reason why is incredibly compelling. So the main reason why this occurs is because Edelgard from the Black Eagle's house has decided that the Church of Seiros is corrupt. And has been corrupting the Kingdom of Fodlan for the longest time. And the only way to bring Fodlan into a united front and actually unify the kingdom into a fair, just place is to completely abolish the church and declare war upon them. This causes a huge wave of conflict because, one, you're allied with the Church of Seiros still, depending on what, in all 3 of the major playthroughs, you're still allied with the Church of Seiros, so you must fight against Edelgard throughout this entire time. It just depends on who you're fighting alongside with. So in the Blue Lions playthrough, when you fight alongside when you play the Blue Lions playthrough, when 5 years pass, Byleth goes into a coma during those 5 years, you come back, and then you find Dimitri. And Dimitri's a broken mess. Dimitri is vengeful, he's hateful. He wants to murder Edelgard in the most violent way possible, and it's a complete contrast to how calm and collected he is in the first playthrough, and it's heartbreaking. It truly is. It's amazing how much not only war has done to Dimitri, but how much of a personal stake Dimitri has in this war because of Edelgard. You don't get this in the other 2 playthroughs. You only get this in the Blue Lions playthrough. Dimitri and Edelgard have a certain familial bond because of the fact that they are stepbrother and stepsister. There's possible a certain romance aspect to that. And so the fact that Dimitri feels so personally betrayed by Edelgard because of this, and because of the atrocities of war that Edelgard commits on the Holy Kingdom of Fargus and the Leicester Alliance, Dimitri's a broken man in the time skip, and it takes him a while to get better. there's a good solid portion of the Blue Lions route in the time skip portion that you don't get to bond with Dimitri. You can't have a support with him. You can't eat with him. You can't do anything with him. Dimitri just is a broken man, and he's inconsolable. And it takes it until more tragedy strikes, until he's finally able to snap out of it and realize that he's more than just a monster and a murderer. That's one of the things that he comes to terms with during the time skip, that if he's going to be a monster, if he's going to be a murderer, if he's going to be a killer, he might as well accept it and just live with it. But when you finally get to the point when Dimitri just decides that he's more than that he can be more than a killer, it's one of the most empowering moments. And that lets the Blue Lions playthrough be one of the more emotional routes in the entire gameplay, in the entire gameplay of Three Houses. It's probably the most emotionally resonant, and that's mostly because of Dimitri's redemption from considering himself to his own self-redemption, basically. After that, I played the Golden Deer route, and as I said before, I wasn't a big fan of the house in general, but I liked Claude's story, I liked his ideals, and that's one of the things that is a common theme throughout this entire game, is that not one single character could be considered completely good or completely evil. And this is one of the things that Three Houses does so correct, that a game like Fire Emblem Fates does extremely poorly. And that is that there is a clear gray area in every aspect of this game. There's not really any true evil, true good villain. If there are certain aspects that have made them evil, and there are very human aspects as well. For example, Claude's not a perfect human being as well. We get to learn a little bit more about Claude's story and how he may not be as legitimate of a noble as he's let out to be. But the reason why he is the way he is, and the reason why he schemes, is that he himself also has ideals as well. He also wants to unify Foldland. He doesn't want to just unify Foldland. He wants to destroy the borders of Foldland. He wants to include other kingdoms. He wants to have an all-inclusive world, free of any sort of identity politics, free of any sort of racism. Because that's another thing that goes on. Just like with Path of Radiance, Foldland is not very kind to its neighboring nations. Whether it's the Kingdom of Bridget that Petra's from, or whether it's the Kingdom of Dusker, or another kingdom of Almyra, there is a clear conflict, even not within Foldland itself, but with countries outside of Foldland. And Claude has some extremely powerful ideas of how he wants to fix this. So even though some of the ways he gets there may not be completely legitimate, and he definitely had some nefarious ways that he wishes to attain his goals, but his ideals themselves are still commendable as well. And that still leads us into the Edelgard playthrough as well. I played through the Black Eagles last, and that's one of the things I didn't like about the Black Eagles and the Golden Deer, is that for the most part, their missions are almost exactly alike. Up until the very end, when the story kicks in. When the story majorly kicks in and changes itself rapidly, we get to learn more and more about the Church of Saros and the Black Eagles playthrough and the Golden Deer playthrough. And we learn exactly that they've been kind of hiding things this entire time. They have been fabricating different history about the legends of Foldland, about the legends of the goddess that the Church of Saros worships, about Saint Saros herself. And we find out that a lot of these reasons are exactly why Edelgard does what she does. One of Edelgard's major ideals that influences her is the fact that she thinks that the crests that nobles and commoners have corrupted Foldland. And not only does she want to abolish the church, but she wants to abolish and destroy all crests as well. And that's a very, very strong ideal. And honestly, depending on what kind of person you are, and depending on who you play through first, and how much you connect with Edelgard, and how much you talk with her in supports, you actually feel like you can side with her. And here's where I can talk about the Black Eagles route. The Black Eagles route is actually 2 separate routes altogether, so there's actually 4 different routes in the game. There's the Blue Lions, there's the Golden Deer, and then there's the Black Eagles route, which splits into 2 different routes. The default route that you can go through is the Church of Saros route, where you still side with the Church of Saros. You side with the Church of Saros in both the Blue Lions and the Golden Deer, and then also in this Black Eagles route as well. You're just still in the Black Eagles house with all your Black Eagles house members, besides Edelgard and her retainer Hubert. But depending on what you do in the month leading up to the time skip, you can then ultimately get the choice to side with Edelgard. And then you learn more about where Edelgard's intentions are, where they come from. And that's one of the best things about the story about Fire Emblem Three Houses, that even after playing all 3 of the games, not only am I not 100% certain, I'm not sure exactly which house I particularly like the most, because they all are an integral part of a whole. That's also one of the weird things about this game, is that there's no golden ending. Unlike Fire Emblem Revelations, which bridged together everything, tried to close every loophole in the most stupid way possible, Fire Emblem Three Houses doesn't have a clear-cut canon, quote-unquote, ending. There's the Blue Lions route, which ends its certain way. There's the Golden Deer route that ends its certain way as well. There's the Black Eagles route, either Edelgard's route or the Church of Saros route, that ends its certain way too. There's not a single real true golden path, a golden ending possible. And I really like that, because if this game had a golden ending, that would completely destroy so much of the great moral ambiguity that Three Houses was setting up for itself. And that's one of the best strengths of Three Houses. One of my friends, Tyler, and I were talking about it. He hasn't actually finished the game quite yet, but he's a good portion of the way through the time skip. Him and I have talked about just the character motivations, and this is the first time in a long time in a JRPG that we can actually talk about the character motivations, the psychology, the personalities of some characters, especially in a Fire Emblem game. It's been a long time since we could do that and actually delve into the character ideals and their motivations. The furthest amount of depth we can go into Fire Emblem Fates is that King Garen bad, Corrin dumb, both my families hate me, or whatever. This is so much different than It's so much more different in Three Houses than it is in any other Fire Emblem game, besides Genealogy of the Holy War and Path of Radiance. In all honesty, the story itself might be better than Path of Radiance, I think. After playing it 3 different times, and having all the pieces of the puzzle, and learning more about the lore of Fodlan, Three Houses works better as a narrative than any other video game, than most JRPGs I've played. And if there was a book series, if they could rewrite the dialogue in the form of a novel or a book, I would totally read this, because there are some fantasy novels that are not as deep as their lore as this game is. It's incredible. So I think that's it for the spoiler section. I don't want to talk too much about the spoilers anymore, because I want some of the bigger surprises of this game to come at you guys later. So I'm going to go and talk about some of the technical aspects. This podcast is running so long right now anyways. I'm just going to go over the technical aspects. So graphically, the game doesn't look super special. This is probably the best looking Fire Emblem game. Most Fire Emblem games have looked pretty good, at least for the 3DS. Shadows of Valentia look very good, and this game does too. There's a nice cel-shaded aspect to the game that does help with the anime aesthetic. The anime art style itself is great too. I definitely prefer the art style of this game over Fire Emblem Fates and Awakening. I personally like the new character designer that they got. I thought all the character designs pop a lot better than they do in Awakening. I felt my problem with Fire Emblem Awakening is that the characters felt like they were just NPCs that you could just change the hair color on and just make them into a different NPC. So I wasn't a big fan of that. In terms of some of the system hangups, I have noticed that if there are more characters on screen, the game kind of chugs along a little bit. There is a couple frame drops. They're not that bad. They don't hamper the game too much, but the game definitely does seem like it's pushing the hardware a little bit slightly, and they could have maybe optimized it just a bit better. Another aspect of the game that's fantastic is the soundtrack. The soundtrack for Fire Emblem Three Houses is definitely one of the best soundtracks I've heard of. It's a relatively small soundtrack. There are certain story soundtracks that are definitely repeated a lot. There are support conversations themes that are repeated a lot as well. The big selling points of the soundtrack, though, are the map themes. Whether it's the main battle theme that you start from the beginning of the game, Foldland Winds, or Chasing Daybreak, the post-time skip theme, or the Tempest of Seasons, the extra battle theme, or the 3 separate final boss themes, which are all killer tracks. This is easily probably the best Fire Emblem soundtrack of all, and it is a real dang shame that Nintendo ninjas are constantly taking down the soundtrack to Fire Emblem 3 Houses on YouTube, because man, it sure would be nice to get to listen to the soundtrack every once in a while. Just saying, Nintendo, if you want to release this OCT for sale, I'll buy it. I'm pretty sure a lot of people will, but until you do, you can't. It'd be nice if you would stop copyright striking all the people who do post the tracks up on YouTube. Okay, so I think that's all I got to say about Fire Emblem Three Houses. All said and done, I'm not sure if I'm ready to call this my favorite Fire Emblem game yet. I've only just now finished the game 3 times. I'm going to play some more stuff, but we have DLC coming along the way, and I've heard that there's another story route that's going to come around in April. I can't wait till that comes out. I'd like to see what more lore we can find out about Foldland. Even right now, I'm actually still playing the game another route. I haven't actually finished the route where you get to play alongside Edelgard. From what I understand, the route is actually a little bit shorter than the other 3 routes, so I know for a fact that it won't take me that long to finish it once I finally get to it. But there are other games I want to play for right now, and I'd rather let this game stew on it a little bit. And I'm glad, of all things, I've been able to talk about this game a little bit, because I do think that this is one of the deeper JRPGs I've ever played before. This is certainly maybe the most mature Fire Emblem game I've ever played too. I really, really hope that as we move forward with the Fire Emblem series, that they can make more changes to the gameplay, but still keep these strong narrative, moral, ambiguous story choices. I can't wait until we see more Fire Emblem games like this. I know this game is doing well enough, and I hope it's going to do even better. I hope this brings in even more fans. The game is extremely playable. Like I said, it's not the hardest game ever. You can definitely change up the gameplay. You can still use normal, or you can use normal hard, or you can use casual, or you can use classic. There's so many ways that this game can cater towards casual and veterans, and it's actually kind of insane, because this could easily be the first Fire Emblem game that can finally bridge together the veterans and the casuals together, even better than Awakening did. So I'm going to go ahead and close off today's podcast. I want to thank you guys so much for listening in. And again, we have been talking about Fire Emblem The Three Houses. If you have not played this game and you own a Nintendo Switch, I highly recommend playing this game. This could easily be your first Fire Emblem game ever. If you have never played a tactical RPG before, if you definitely know your JRPGs well enough, this is a great game to start off on. If you don't want to have too much of a hard time, if you want to enjoy this story that I have been talking about, this incredibly well-written, very mature story, please play the game on casual mode, play it on normal mode, play it on easier difficulty, get through the story, get invested in the characters, get invested in the plotline, learn more about the lore in this game. Because there's so much that goes into this game that it's actually kind of insane that this much thought was put into a game in the Fire Emblem series when Fire Emblem has been so simplistic recently. I can't give this game anything higher than my overall praise, and I think so far out of all the video games I've talked about on this podcast, this was probably my favorite one to play and to talk about, and I'm so glad that I live in a time now when I get to play this game, and I hope we get to play more Fire Emblem games like this. I hope more JRPGs take this take the lessons that this game had to heart. But thank you so much for listening in, and everybody. Now, again, we're going to go back to the 2 topics a week next week, but I just wanted to talk about Fire Emblem and the 3 houses today. So thank you so much for listening in. If you want to see this channel grow even further, again, my Patreon's down in the description below. Please, if you have anything that you'd like to give that could help out the podcast, that would definitely be appreciated. And I just want to say thank you so much, and I will gladly see you guys again in the next episode.